Let's move on to another example and learn about separating HTML and JavaScript into separate files. As you write a lot of JavaScript code, create a lot of HTML for different pages, and build a fully fledged web application, you'll notice that you can't simply have one page which has all the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. You need to logically break these into different components. So you have the HTML and then you have multiple HTML pages. You have CSS, which is specified in a different separate CSS file. We've seen that earlier. And you can have multiple CSS files. And lastly, you'll have the JavaScript itself specified in a different file. And you can have multiple JavaScript files as well. Let's see how to do that. In real life, while building up a web page, the HTML and CSS portion and the JavaScript portions are often written by different people. Since JavaScript is a fully fledged programming language, you might have developers who specialize in writing JavaScript. You might have designers who are good at writing HTML and CSS and making the page look exactly like you want it to. Since these are completely different skills, that's not to say people don't work on it together. It's often different people working on these, so it makes sense to have separate HTML, CSS files and separate JavaScript files so they can work on it independently. This logical separation of concerns is an important reason to put HTML and JavaScript separately. It's also neat, easy to maintain, and readable. This is why from here on we'll try and separate the JavaScript and the HTML wherever we can. To see how this can be done, let's start with the HTML file that we'd used in our last example. This is a simple regular HTML file, nothing really special about it. Once again, we have the script tags which hold the JavaScript that's embedded in this file. Nothing really complicated about this. Here is the JavaScript that's embedded within the script tag. This is what we started off with in the previous example. What we're going to do here is basically create a separate file for the JavaScript. So we want this JavaScript in the script tag to be factored out into a separate file. So the function print hello world, that's what will move into a different file. So we simply extract that portion, the print hello world, and move it to a different file. So we've factored out the JavaScript. The file on the left should only have the HTML, and we'll create a new file shown on the right which will only hold the JavaScript. Once we've separated the HTML and the JavaScript, this is how it will look. The HTML file will no longer have the embedded JavaScript within it, and the JavaScript file will obviously not have any HTML. However, now we have to look at something new. How do we say that this particular HTML file has access to that JavaScript? How do we say that these two are associated with each other? And that's where the source attribute of the script tag comes in. The JavaScript file needs to be explicitly referenced from the HTML file in order to indicate that there is an association between these two. There has to be a way to indicate that the behavior of that HTML page can be affected by this JavaScript. And this is done by the source attribute in the script tag of the HTML. If you observe the source attribute, the value is example_3.js. And this particular value is the name of the JavaScript file. It's actually the full path to the JavaScript file. And you know that you can use relative paths in HTML, just like we saw earlier with image paths, href paths, and so on. So this example underscore 3.js references the JavaScript file which has the functions print hello world. It's explicitly referenced. So far, what we've seen in these examples is that an HTML file can contain any number of script tags. There is no limitation on that, and you can embed as much JavaScript as you want within an HTML file. These script tags, some of them directly enclose the JavaScript code. That's what you call embedded JavaScript in an HTML file. However, you can also have script tags which reference a separate JavaScript file. They don't actually embed the JavaScript code in the HTML file. They simply point to a JavaScript file which is considered embedded in the code. So we've separated the files, but the end result is the same. Now, these script tags, we've seen that some of them are in the head tag of the HTML. So an HTML has the head and the body. We've seen that script tags can be embedded in the head of the HTML, and we can see that script tags can also exist in the body tag of the HTML. Both of these are valid and correct. Now let's see the implications of these. Now, one of the most important aspects to consider in any web page is how fast it loads. How fast can you get it to load so that the user sees something right away? This is the difference between well-designed pages and poorly designed pages. Poorly designed pages do not give user feedback immediately. This is what makes this point important. Your page will load the quickest if you place the JavaScript in a separate file and reference it from the body of the HTML rather than from the head. So your page will load the quickest. This means it's something we want. It's something that's desirable. What we need to do for it is to place the JavaScript in a separate file, not embedded into your HTML. And we need to reference this separate file from the body element of the HTML rather than from the head element. Now let's see why that is so. Let's consider how a web page is actually loaded. When a web page is loaded, it's rendered from the top to the bottom. The browser looks at the elements from the top and starts rendering them and then renders the elements at the bottom. Browsers scan the HTML page line by line and render the HTML, read the JavaScript, interpret it, and figure out what needs to be loaded. Anything that lives in the head of the HTML is not visible to the user. You know that from the HTML and CSS portions of this class. Anything that's in the body is visible to the user. So since the head is rendered first or read first before the body is rendered, if you place the JavaScript in the head, it will be loaded before the page is rendered. And only when the page is rendered is something shown on screen. Since JavaScript controls the behavior of the visible elements, there's no point in loading the JavaScript before the visible elements can be shown to the user. Which is why you want to load the JavaScript in the body. You don't want the JavaScript to be, loaded in, interpreted, checked, etc. before the page can be seen by the user. So in good web page design, you want to show the visual elements to the user first. Because if you don't, it makes the page seem slow, as the user gets no visual information till the entire JS is interpreted and loaded into the browser. So going back to those choices which we could make to directly embed the JavaScript or use a separate file, to put the JavaScript script elements in the head or the body. The correct choices are keeping the JavaScript in a separate file and referencing the JavaScript using script tags which are present in the body of the HTML. These are the right choices to make to have a a page which loads faster and gives immediate visual feedback to the user.